Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I am joined here by a special person who contributed to our volume, A Praying People, and she works at Taylor University in Upland, Indiana. And she contributed a chapter in the book Lament, A Journey from Pain to Praise. And so I'm excited to welcome Dr. May Young. How are you, Dr. Young? It's good to see you.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit about, I know academic career, we're filming this December 14th. And so my guess is you're just finishing up the semester. So what did you teach this semester? What's your normal kind of, what are your favorite classes, I suppose? And are you teaching any of those?
Sure. Well, I'm wrapping up the semester, and right now I was teaching Hebrew language like the first semester, so that's always fun.
Nice.
Students come in not even knowing how to read the alphabet, and they come out and they're translating sentences right now, so which is great. And it's part of like we have 2 years of Hebrew, biblical Hebrew at Taylor,
Okay.
so that's always nice, and that fulfills like language requirements for a BA for our
Nice.
students. So
Yeah.
some of our students are Bible majors, some of them are not, and they just want to learn a little bit more about biblical Hebrew and using language and reading the text. Another class that I'm teaching is the Hebrew prophets. So, kind of walking through the prophets with students. So, it's surprising. I feel like a lot of times people in the church don't really know a lot about the prophets.
Yeah.
Well, the Old Testament, they're probably not as familiar as the New Testament, which is sad because I love the Old Testament. But Hebrew prophets seems to be something that, a lot of people don't really are not as familiar with, and so we go through that together. So that's another course. And then I teach historic Christian belief. That's sort of
Okay.
like a cross between historical theology and systematic theology. So kind of walking through, just some of the core doctrines, Trinity, Christology, soteriology. It's one of our main biblical core classes at Taylor.
Yeah.
So that's just one of the ones that I enjoy teaching as well. Another course that I have taught in the past, but I'll be teaching more regularly, will be like Hebrew poetry and wisdom
Great.
literature. So I haven't done that for a little bit, but I'll be picking that up again. Um, and because I'm the program director at in biblical studies, so I get like a course release to do some more administrative stuff, I guess. And so, um,
Always fun.
yeah, it'll be always fun. But I'm going
Administration
on a
ranks right up
J
there with
term trip.
grading, right? I mean,
Huh?
it's like grading and administration are almost tied for last
That's
place
right.
and
That's right.
what's enjoyable in higher education.
That's so true. It's so true. But in J term, which is coming in January, that's our January term, I get to co-lead right now this year a trip with students to Greece and Italy. So that'll be fun.
Oh,
Yeah, and
that sounds
walking in
horrible.
the footsteps of Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds horrible. Yeah. I was just over in Germany. I took a German trip and got to it was just my wife, but so I was
Oh,
the horribly inept Reformation guide while we
oh,
were over
very
there.
nice.
And yeah, it was a lot of fun. We did Wittenberg, we did Berlin, and then we hit Munich, and we're really mostly in the Nuremberg area. So a lot
Very,
of
very
fun. Yeah.
nice.
I find us Old Testament folks need to stick together because you know I did I we found out in the pre-interview we both did our PhDs at Trinity,
That's
and
right.
so you were under Dr. McGarry, right?
That's right.
And what was your dissertation in? No, you don't have to go into the whole thing, but I know
Sure.
mine has a really long, unfortunate title that no one really even wants to read. But what was your dissertation on?
Mine was actually on the Book of Lamentations. So it's on the
Okay,
topic of lament. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And
So
so
you've been
kind
doing
of
that for a
my,
while then.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I've been working on Lamentations and lament and that topic. So Lamentations, I was looking at a lot of like the poetic devices in the book and how they
Yeah.
function together, sort of like a matrix system. And then Dr. John Monson was my second reader
Yeah.
for that as well. So
Yeah. And we also both know him. I had John at Wheaton College when I was there. So
That's right.
fantastic guy. Kind of small world, right?
Yes,
Especially for folks in the Chicagoland area.
that's right.
Trinity is just such a great spot. Shameless plug for our alma mater here. Ted's just had such a great faculty, especially when I was there. All the Old Testament folks were
Oh, yeah.
excellent.
Wonderful.
Obviously the systematics folks are great. I didn't know much about the New Testament folks, but they don't, they don't
They're
need
great
much
too.
more. Yeah, they're great too, I guess. But so tell us a little bit about maybe Lamentations. I think, just like you said with the prophets, I'm guessing a lot of people aren't as familiar with Lamentations as they might be. It doesn't read quite as easily as something like Romans or Philippians
Yes,
might.
yeah.
And so how would you talk about approaching Lament or Lamentations, the book, from a Christian perspective?
Well, I think that the Book of Lamentations is different because it's poetry. So you're going to
Yeah.
have a lot of imagery. There's a lot of poetic devices. There's, even in sentence structure, um, just the number of voices that are present, and that it's an acrostic. So acrostic meaning, every, for our listeners, that every, sentence, every paragraph, or strophe, or however you want to see it, it begins with one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and then is progressive. So actually, four of the chapters in Lamentations are acrostic. The last one is not, but it has 22 lines in that last chapter, which some people think correspond to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet.
Yeah.
So, but and so they see it as more of an, almost implied acrostic, I guess, with the share number. I don't subscribe to that, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's very highly structured book.
Yeah.
But I think it really gives voice to pain and suffering, that you can see there. And so even looking at that, the ability for us as believers, when we experience pain, or when we see other people experience pain, or we hear about that, there is room for us to give voice to pain, and even turning to God even when it seems hopeless, or even when it seems, for Lady Jerusalem, she acknowledges her sin. So even after, if there's situations where we feel like we've sinned, as well, that there's still room for us to turn to God, and really even to mourn our pain and to mourn our circumstances, and that we can still wait and press in, and that's actually an act of faith. So I think Lamentations is really a testament to an act of faith in the midst of pain, and turning to God, and not necessarily seeing a resolution, because the book itself doesn't end clearly with a resolution, but it ends on waiting on the Lord. And so I think sometimes with lament, there's a sense of waiting, and we sort of, I think, living in a world today, we want instant results. We want God to answer us. We want the pain to be taken away. And we don't know how to wait, sometimes, on the Lord in hope. And so I think Lamentations is a testament to that, and helps us to see that. What I found in my research was that um, even the very structure of the book sort of mirrors the process of lament, in terms of voices, and how there's a progression, and how sometimes when we're in our pain in the beginning, we're just so stuck with our own perspective, but as we
Yeah.
have more voices coming in, that we allow ourselves to be more open to even a communal voice, and that's how the book ends, with a communal lament, with people lamenting together. And so, and then, coming together and waiting on the Lord together. And so there's some kind of like a movement in that as well.
Yeah. When you're talking, it sort of strikes me, one of the things I had on the program a guy who specialized in Ecclesiastes,
Mm,
Russ Meek, and he talked about, Ecclesiastes is in some ways not lament, obviously, but it's dealing with the tension of everyday life and the maybe we could call it the unfulfilled expectations
mhm,
that often people can feel about, like, why isn't my life better, or I'm a pretty good person, or I'm doing justice and righteousness, in Old Testament language, and life just
sure.
doesn't seem to be working out for me. And between these two conversations and what you just said, I think one of the things that always is of interest to me when people look at the Old Testament. It's like, well, Old Testament's an old book. We're really in Christ, and so what we really need is the New Testament. But I think, while a lot of these things sort of culminate and center in Christ, we're still a people who are waiting. Like, we still need to understand how to wait, how to anticipate, because what Christ started hasn't been finished yet. And
Yes.
so we still go through a lot of suffering and pain. And so it just strikes me that Lamentations would have such strong application to present day.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, and I do think that along with the Psalms, is, showcasing too that, there's just a very emotional element to our faith that sometimes is uncomfortable maybe for us in the West, because we've become maybe more independent and more, I guess, stoic in some ways. I don't know.
Yeah.
And as we approach it, and almost like within the church, like how are we how can we be more expressive in our relationship with the Lord? And I think the Psalms and Lamentations really modeled that for us.
I think that's fair. I think it's interesting. I mean, it's almost like we're a little more Spock and a little less Kirk if you're into
Yeah,
Star Trek. But I
true.
also think that, the expression we're comfortable with
Yes.
seems to be less despairing
Mm.
and more happy and joyful, and I could sing of God's love forever, as opposed to sort of the what I think some people might construe as wallowing,
Yes.
and
Yes.
just sort of pity and frustration and hopelessness in
Mm.
Lamentations. And
Hmm.
so I'll be interested to dig into that a little bit, because obviously you
Sure.
wrote the chapter on lament and prayer. And I'm not sure that lament is a common practice within the church today. And so why don't we take just a quick break here? And then when
Hmm.
we come back, we can talk about the connection between lament and prayer, and maybe even some of the characteristics of lament within what could be
Sure.
Christian prayer.
Sounds
So
good.
we'll be right back and we'll talk about that. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Here with Dr. Young, and we are talking about lament. And so before the break, we were going to talk and discuss a little bit about the connection between lament and prayer. So tell us about the chapter you wrote for praying people a little bit, and then
Sure.
maybe we can get into a more general discussion about lament and prayer.
Sure. So the chapter that I contributed, it's actually focusing on lament and prayer, but more specifically that lament is actually a journey. So it's a journey from pain to praise. So it's not just, it goes antithetical to the notion of it being just wallowing in our sadness.
Yeah.
And so it's not just, you know, lamentation is not the end itself. So we're not just here to lament and seeing it as end. It's actually to move us forward in our journey, to even bring us to greater hope. And that's kind of what we see in a lot of the laments in the book of Psalms, and even in the structure of the book of Psalms in general. And so that's kind of what I cover in the book, how there's actually more Psalms of praise in the beginning of the book of Psalms, with and moving to, or actually more, I'm sorry, that's the reverse, more laments in the beginning, and then more praise at the end. So you're moving
Okay.
from laments to more praise, even in the book of Psalms itself. Of course, it's not a clear cut, number of Psalms, but definitely if you were to look at the number of lament Psalms towards, the beginning of the Psalter, there's a progression that culminates even in, the concluding chapters of, five praises, in that way as well. So my chapter talks a little bit about how it moves from the structure of the Psalm itself, having more laments and moving towards the direction of praise. And of course, it's also, in some ways a cyclical event too, of how, in life, it's not always just a straight trajectory from lament to praise,
Right.
but there's always, coming back and forth in that way too, but there's just movement in that way. And then I move into how even in the structure of lament psalms, there's different elements in that have been identified in scholarship on lament psalms itself, like five different elements. So I walk through those elements in my chapter, and then I finish off with an example of Psalm 13, how it contains those elements. And so a lot of the elements that are present, and they're not present in all lament psalms, but most of them contain them, and not necessarily in the same order, but a lot of them have, address to God, a lament, praise, or complaint section, motivations, and then confession of trust, or being heard, assurance of being heard, and then a vow of praise. So kind of a sort of a progression in that. And
Yeah.
sometimes, it's not always, a clear trajectory, but they do contain some of these elements as well.
Do you think, I mean, as you look at that progression, do you think that, because I mean, the Bible never, to my knowledge, really never talks about here's how you lament, and here's
Mm-hmm,
why lament sort of leads to praise. This is,
mm-hmm,
and so there's a part of me that wants to say this is probably like all these different examples in this movement from lament to praise is intended to be almost prescriptive, right? Like, don't just sit in the pain of life, but move toward praise of God. But then there's also a side of me that wonders if it's more of a descriptive kind of idea that as we're authentic before the Lord, as we're honest before the Lord, this is inevitably where these things sort of move. Like, what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I mean, just like when we think about, the Lord's Prayer, that we pray those elements, like there's a sense of, how we do, those are the elements in our life that we want to lift up to the Lord. But at the
Yeah.
same time, there's also a prescription in that too, that we model in that way too. So I would say, since, the book of Psalms is really a book of prayers and, even a book of hymns and a book of, that it's modeling it for us, but it's also showing us to what happens as we lament in the life of the psalmist as well. So I think there's an element of both to that.
I think it's interesting as your comment about the Psalms and there being more lament Psalms at the beginning than there are at the end. I mean, for one, I think a lot of people wouldn't ever notice that because the Psalms are a fairly large book, and sitting down and counting them is going to be challenging, right? Um, but it also just sort of strikes me that there may be something there that points to a hole in the way that we tend to deal with our Christian lives today. Like, I'm
Mhm,
not sure that I see the Christian church having a sufficient amount of lament, maybe, to
mhm,
lead us into praise. And I know that's not the only
yeah.
way to get there, but
Mhm,
I mean, how would you sort of counsel the church, I suppose, right,
mhm,
through that
yeah.
Psalter? Does it actually teach us a lesson, or is it just a structural observation?
Well, I do think that in the church, and I've written this some other places as well, but I feel like maybe there's a culture of triumphalism within the church. Because for
Okay.
myself, I grew up in a church that really never talked about lament. And so I didn't even really
Yeah.
understand what that concept was until I started, actually going through a very difficult time in my life. And then I started, researching into this topic alone. Thankfully, more people are exposed to the concept of lament today, just,
Yeah.
since we've gone through so much as a people and as a nation. But I feel like within the church, there's always been more of like testimonies that come after people have overcome difficult
Yeah.
periods. So we
Yeah.
don't really, and that's what I mean by this culture of triumphalism, so that a lot of the testimonies we hear is like this person has struggled and then, they were delivered or they've overcome and they're doing great now. So there's a real sense of deliverance, a sense of, doing. And so it leaves a lot of people not, having an expectation that they need to move into this place of like overcoming and almost like very quickly, or like, or something's wrong, God's
Yeah.
not, delivering them, or what do we do with this pain? And so there's not, and so we don't really hear people who are in the midst of it, which is unfortunate. For a long time, people don't really talk about it. So we don't hear about people really struggling and not really having a resolution but we always
Yeah.
hear about people who've struggled and have resolved things. And so we're not really shown this whole process of lament, or what it looks like when things don't get better, or when the next day is just as tough as today. How do
Right.
we, how do we navigate that as believers? And And so I feel like there's a lot of people who almost feel ashamed that they're struggling, or ashamed that they're, still grieving or still dealing with these things. And there's not a real sense of, openness. And in fact, when I taught about lament overseas before for a course, there were some students who would say, it's hard for leaders to admit their struggles because there's judgment. People judge them, they feel judged, or people. So it doesn't really, um, it's not really giving that a place of honesty for people to really show. I feel like it's almost like the church is a place where we put our best foot forward. And so I hear people say, well, you know what? I'm just not up to going to church today. I don't, I'm like, what is that? Why do we have to be up to go to church?
Right.
And so, but I do hear that very often, or, I just don't feel like, really good. So I'm not going to go to church today. And so like, almost like as if church is only a place where we go when we feel good and we feel ready to show the world that we feel good, or, so
Yeah.
allowing that some room maybe for the church to do a little bit more, um, giving places for people to lament even during the service, it would be helpful too.
It's such an interesting thing to think about, though. You know, so I mean, first, I talk about this a lot on the podcast. Like, I love lifting weights. Like, I enjoy working out, and there is a sense in which no pain, no gain.
Sure.
Right? The pain is just part of the process, and you have
Yes.
to put the effort in. And there's that sort of work and effort that you're putting in,
Yeah.
that ultimately leads to something down the road that is beneficial for you.
Yes.
And I think that if we don't appreciate that work,
Yeah.
right, especially if you don't appreciate the work in the weight room, you kind of go in there and just are lackadaisical and just hope that you get the results you want. It's like, well, that's not realistic.
Yeah.
And I think there's some sort of loose analogy there with
Mm-hmm.
lament too.
Mm-hmm.
If the pain is relegated to something that we really just want to get out of,
Mm-hmm.
right, as opposed to something that we should live in,
Mm-hmm.
appreciate to some
Mm-hmm.
degree,
Mm-hmm.
recognize as part of the growth process,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
a progression in our faith. I
Mm-hmm.
think it opens us up to a lot of different sort of maladies. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you could see, instead of lament, do we just get sort of complaining, in the more common contemporary vernacular?
Sure. Sure.
Instead of lament, do we just get people hiding their sin, hiding their, there's all these different things that I think could arise that lament would be really great for. But
Yes.
because we're not practicing it now, what we're seeing is the sort of cracks that are created when we put
Right.
aside a really important practice.
That's right. That's right. And this is where I say that, lament really is an act of faith.
Yeah.
It's an act of faith because we're turning to God, in our pain and in our complaints. Even, I mean, you see that in the psalmist.
Yeah.
They're turning, and that's the whole. People are like, well, isn't it wrong to complain? How about the Israelites in the desert? And but that kind of complaint was they were complaining to each other. They were complaining.
Right.
They already made a decision on what they thought about God, and they were complaining.
Yeah.
But in lament and complaints towards God, you're actually coming to God. You're not, and it's a faith. It's kind of like if you have a good friend, or even in your marriage, you're not going to go and complain about your wife to your friend. That's not really helpful. But when you come to your wife and you actually, you know, are honest with your feelings, that actually brings intimacy. You're able to be honest, you're able to work it out, you're able to, and it's the people that you feel closest to that you can feel like you can be vulnerable and you can show them warts and all. And that's really what, when we're lamenting, we're showing too that there's a dimension in our relationship with God, that there's a closeness, and that we're pressing into him in our pain. We're pressing into him when our life is not looking like the way that we feel like it should even. And so there's a disconnect from our theology and what we're living out. And so we could bring it up and bring to God the promises of God, and really stand in that. So it's kind of like a sense of hope and trusting in God, and bringing this and just being honest in the midst of our lives.
I think that's great. let me take a minute, take a little bit of a break, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about lament. But give us just a few minutes. We'll be right back. Hey everybody, we're back. We're going to be talking about lament a little bit more, and I had a question about this. I It's something I think about a fair amount. You know, a lot of times when I'll experience pain in my life, I have an idea of what's causing that pain, of what I actually want to have changed, why this is coming about, and I'm wondering, how do we formulate both individually and maybe even corporately the content of lament? Like, what's our focus as we're doing it?
Sure. Well, I do think there's also a biblical precedence because um, I'm actually working on a book right now with InterVarsity Press on recovering biblical lament. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at individual psalms for different situations. So you have lament.
Okay.
So a lament for health reasons is different from a lament in unjust circumstances or a lament in loneliness. And so there are psalms um, in the Bible that kind of have a different, way of lamenting. And so I think some of those are instructive for us too, as we think about, lament in during times of loneliness, as opposed to lament during anger, or, so you have imprecatory Psalms. So there's different ways. So I think there's some of the Psalms are instructive for us too, as we
Okay.
come even on an individual level. And even on a corporate level, I think there are certain things of, what are things that are addressing our community, and of course, the things that we address issues today are different from what we see in the Old Testament, of course.
Sure.
And so sometimes, some issues that might be, looming in our churches on a corporate level, um, and maybe it's some people who think that, and there might be some disagreement on that end. But, I think if the church is bringing it out in the open, and lamenting it, I think it opens up for conversation, for real conversation. And I think only in that kind of real conversation can we actually move forward. Doesn't mean that everybody has to agree, but I
Yeah.
think that we're, instead of sweeping it under the rug, there could be a sense of, coming together and acknowledging and also working together too, and a real sense of humility before one another as these issues are brought up. And I think that's important. And, it's not always going to be pretty when we come to lament, whether it be individual or on a corporate level. I mean, and some of this, we see even in scripture, some of the wrestling that we see in the prophets, some of the wrestling of, God, why have you forsaken me? Some of, it's not always necessarily true, but it's
Yeah.
something that we experience. And it's okay to bring that up in the light of community and the light of the Lord, and allowing God and the Holy Spirit to move us in the right direction as well.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, now that you're talking through it, I when I was a dean, I was a dean when Donald Trump got elected. And a lot of the minority students on campus organized a corporate lament. And so as a new dean, I decided it would probably be good for me to go and just be there. And I will say, it was definitely eye-opening for me. As someone who has never really been a huge political animal, and
Sure.
didn't,
Yeah.
wasn't really thinking in those terms at all. I mean,
Yeah.
just to hear what the students were saying and to experience the emotion that they were
Hmm.
feeling around the issues, right? It goes beyond
Hmm.
sort of a, we have political disagreements and we all
Sure.
understand that sort of vibe. It was very much like, whether their fears were ever realized or not,
Sure.
they were real fears.
Yes.
Like their emotions were very real. And I
Yes.
do think, just again hearing you give that answer, it sort of took me back to that place where it was like, yeah, it did open me up to these other people.
Sure.
Not in the sense that I agreed with everything, but in the sense
Right.
that, wow, they're feeling this pain. And so how should I now, sort of reconfigure and rethink the way that I interact and the way that I speak, what I talk about, how I work
Hmm.
with that in order to build them up as members of the body of Christ.
Yes. Yeah. And that's so important. And I think that comes in, like when you look at the book of Lamentations in chapter one, one of
Yeah.
the reoccurring refrains is that there was no comforter for her. So really what
Mm,
Lady Jerusalem was looking for was someone to witness her pain, because she wanted someone to understand and see her pain, and there
Yeah.
wasn't any person. And so here, as a body of Christ, we're called to hurt with those who hurt and rejoice with those who rejoice. And so, like, when we hear the pain of our brother and sister, to come along to be a witness is in many ways a comfort for them. We don't realize that, but that really, you know you're standing alongside with someone in that way. And so there was a quote, I think, that, when you have two people sharing the pain, the load gets lighter, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you don't have to carry it all by yourself. And so it's not necessarily us agreeing, but actually
Yeah.
seeing someone in pain, witnessing to that, really brings a sense of comfort to that too. And that's where, sometimes when people are going through deep suffering, you don't even have to say anything with them. You could just sit there with them to be, presence, that ministry of presence, that witnessing of the things that they're going through.
Yeah. I think lament has that potential to sort of bring us together in ways that we're not recognizing at all. And just again, as you're speaking there, I'm thinking back on the book of Job, right? Where you see
Hmm.
Job in this really deep lament, wondering what God is doing to him. And then
Hmm.
his buddies come around and they're like, listen, you just got this all wrong. And
Yeah.
they're trying to, not really trying to solve his problem. I mean, I guess they're okay with Job suffering, but they're trying to give him like the recipe for moving from, lament, being destroyed basically to not being destroyed.
Yeah.
And Job's just like, what the heck? Like
Yeah.
this is not what I was hoping for from you guys.
Yeah.
Like you're not even hearing me,
That's
right?
right. That's
I'm
right.
the righteous sufferer and
Yeah.
you're trying to tell me just to repent. Like that doesn't even
Yeah.
make sense.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons here that we could look at from a lament perspective. So have you talked about, and I grew up in the same churches probably, or I went to similar churches that didn't really talk about lament at all. Um, I'm wondering if you've ever experienced lament within a church context, and if so, sort of what you might suggest for churches who are just wanting to dip a toe into the lament space. What does this really look like for a church to do this?
Well, I've been to churches where they've, incorporating, maybe even in times of worship, some lament
Yeah.
songs, so
Yeah.
that, people who are not necessarily ready to praise, can actually be, more uh, meditative, and
Okay.
even allowing for that. So some space within the church to allow for that.
Yeah.
That's something small, or even during times of corporate prayer, to give room and silence for those who are dealing with, a real tough time, and giving them space to talk with the Lord on that. Because sometimes people, we talk about lament, but people don't know how to even lament when they're on their own. So when they're in a corporate setting, to, even allow them to have that space to be honest with God, um, and just come before Him. And if it's only silence, it's only silence. But, maybe giving some space, and walking them through what that might look like for them personally, helping them in that way too. I think that those are just helpful. Or, if there's a larger issue that has been dealt with within the church. I've been in an institution where, there was a lament service, and some of the things that had happened that was tough in that particular institution, um, they were able to lament together. And so many people felt after that service that it was just healing, because it was acknowledged, and these issues were brought up into the open. And so people can feel a sense of freedom to even, mourn the losses, or, mourn the frustrations, or some of the things that had happened, instead of just, moving forward. And so that
Yeah.
actually gave room for people to move forward, because this was acknowledged. It's almost like sometimes in a relationship, when something's wrong and nobody says anything, and you just move forward, it's just going to be awkward for, but when you bring it back up and you're saying, hey, these things that happened, maybe it wasn't handled the best way, you know
Yeah.
or maybe, how can we hear you better, even in a relationship, that helps you to move forward, in the relationship itself. And so, even as a community, you can move forward instead of just moving awkwardly, like, I don't know,
Right.
so people feeling a sense of loss or lostness or something like that.
So I think my last round of questions here. I won't say the last questions because it probably won't be the last one, but my last round of questions. You talked earlier and you talked about lament and its relationship to patience, right? And sort of waiting on the Lord and that
Mhm.
breaking through in praise. Sometimes what I see happening is, let's call it lament, right? A complaint is raised,
Mhm.
right? Either to God or others. And then there's an expectation for immediate action. So in other words, and again, in the sense that we've lost true lament, right?
Yes.
We tend to view this as almost like comment cards that come in and we say, this isn't right for me. And so I need somebody to fix this for me. And if it's not
Yeah,
fixed, then I'm going to have to put more in the complaint box, right?
that's right.
Um, and so I'm wondering, like, how close is the connection? Two questions maybe. Number one, is there a connection between lament and action that we should be aware of and understand? And then is there is lament really just that patient process of waiting on the Lord and recognizing that he will be faithful, whether that's through his people or what have you? And so really the question is about lament and action. Like, how are those
Mhm.
two paired?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and I do think that it's different in every situation.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say there's like, a cookie cutter formula for
Okay.
that. But I
Gotcha.
do think that when we're lamenting, this kind of expectation, kind of like you said, that those things should be set aside and just really waiting for the Lord, that maybe there is action that He will prompt us to do as well. So some of that comes there too, but there's some also just a willingness to press in to God. So like for myself, I went through a real, and this is what kind of was sort of a catalyst for me to be even interested in lament. When I was younger, so I'd gone through a divorce due to unfaithfulness of my spouse, and through that experience, it felt like in one day, like my life was just turned upside down, and I didn't
Yeah.
know what to do, and I felt like I was at a complete loss, and I was just hoping the next day would just like be fixed, everything would be okay. But like
Yeah.
walking through that journey and every day, like nothing's changing, but it's still staying where it's at. Like, I could have easily said, you know what, forget this. I'm just gonna walk away. But I at those moments, I felt like I had no one else but the Lord. And so it's like I just pressed into God and I just like sometimes it was just crying. Sometimes there was no action whatsoever. All I could do
Yeah.
was utter prayers of tears and
Yeah.
just being in his presence. And then there was moments where, I just felt like, God was saying, you need to forgive. And there's moments where, so it's kind of lament is almost like coming before God in honesty, but also waiting on God and pressing into that relationship that we have with God. And so I know a lot of
Yeah.
people who've gone through really hard times. They say that was probably the sweetest time, and it was the toughest time, but also the sweetest time in their
Yeah.
relationship with God. Because it's like when you have nothing but the Lord, He becomes that solid rock. And so it's not so much like, as you wait, it's almost like you are pressing into that relationship. And there's moments where he will prompt you to do things, but it's not like a formula. It's just kind of, you know, uh, recognizing that he is there. He's our rock. He's our fortress. And there's a special closeness in our midst of our pain that he understands and he's with us in there. He sits with us in there. And so there's moments where it is sitting and just waiting. And there's moments where, we need to, move forward. Sometimes, the Lord will prompt us and say, for myself, the Lord was saying, you need to go back into this community and be a part of that and let them love you. And so, like, hearing the Lord in the midst of that pain, in the midst of that pressing in, I think is so important. So it's not just, you know, looking belly gazing at our sorrows, but really, bringing it before the Lord and allowing that to grow our relationship with the Lord.
when thinking about it like that, you start to understand the significance then of corporate lament, of actually joining with others in their pain.
Mhm.
Because if we're all sort of waiting on the Lord and we're all joining in that person's lament to the extent that we are capable, I think it becomes far less likely that we are going to come up with our own random solution to help this person out,
That's
or we're
right.
going to
Yeah.
try to reason through the pain, like,
Yeah.
hey, this really shouldn't hurt as bad as you think. Look,
Yeah.
here's the like,
Yeah.
I think if we were all sort of joined together in it, it does give it a whole different context where we're all
Mhm.
now crying out to the Lord for this
Yeah.
solution. It
Yeah.
binds us together in a way that
Yeah.
we wouldn't be otherwise.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, I just think the whole thing is sort of fascinating to think through. How
Yeah.
is it that we can join with our brothers and sisters in Christ, not in celebration, hey, you've overcome this,
Yeah.
but in despair and anticipation
Yes. That's
that you
right.
will overcome this
That's
and
right.
that
Yeah.
we're all going to be involved in some way, but we're not sure
Yeah.
what that way is yet.
Right. Right. Right.
We're just all going to
Mhm.
be open to the prompting. I think
That's
the
right.
individual experience and the corporate experience
Yeah.
kind of mirror each other a little bit.
Yeah. I think so too. I think, and I think there's something to it when people have walked through that journey with you that that also increases the intimacy within those relationships as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. We're coming up at the end of our time, and so I want to give you the opportunity to talk about. You mentioned your book. What should folks be looking for? Do you have a timeline on that? I kind of know how publishing goes, and so a loose timeline. When's the book supposed to be done and out?
Sure. So the book is coming out. It should be coming out in 2024. So next year, in the
Okay.
winter, probably.
Okay.
Called Recovering Biblical Lament. That's the tentative title right now. So
Okay.
we'll see. But it's with InterVarsity Press with that. And it's just a book about, lament and also looking at specific examples of, lament and during times of anger or, loneliness. And I want to put examples too of different people who've walked that journey
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Well, I think I'm going to link people to your faculty page at Taylor University,
great. Uh-huh.
and so people can keep up. And hopefully, whenever the book comes out, maybe you can come back on and talk a little bit more about Lament in the book. And
Sure.
it'd be fantastic to have you back. I really appreciate the insights you shared today. Lament is it's one of those topics. I mean, as an Old Testament guy, I did mostly historical books and dipped into the prophets, right? And so you sort of skim over. It was just like when I was talking to Russ Meek about Ecclesiastes. I'm like, this book is like a mystery, even to people who, and even to many people who are Old Testament scholars. And I feel kind of the same way about Lament. It's not something that everybody specializes in. And so I'm very, really grateful that you're doing this work and grateful for your contribution to a praying people. And so, yeah, if you want to read more, you can pick up A Praying People. We'll link that in the show notes. And if you want to check out more, from Dr. Young, I'll link you to her university page at Taylor University. And thanks so much for being on. It was a pleasure talking with you about this today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed my time. Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, everybody. We'll catch you on the next episode of Thinking Christian. Thanks, everyone.